I am Morgan, 31 years old, and somehow still healing from the emotional wounds my family inflicted. As a senior forensic accountant, I built a successful life away from their toxicity, but I still maintained occasional contact out of a misplaced sense of duty. At our family Christmas dinner, I barely brushed past my sister Brianna. She slapped me hard across the face in front of everyone and screamed, "Are you blind or just stupid?" My mother snapped at me saying, "Apologize right now or get out." My father did not say a single word, he just walked over and held the front door open. I walked out without making a sound. That night at 2 in the morning, I logged into my corporate portal and executed an order that would freeze every single asset they owned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in our affluent Atlanta suburb meant projecting absolute perfection to the outside world. To the community, my parents Valerie and Harrison were pillars of success. They owned a prominent logistics company and attended all the right social events. But inside our sprawling brick colonial home, an emotional coldness permeated every corner. I learned early on that my sister Brianna, who is 3 years younger than me, was the golden child. She was always draped in designer labels our parents could barely afford, celebrated for her beauty and charm, while my achievements were entirely ignored. The Christmas dinner was supposed to be a grand celebration of our family legacy. The dining room was decorated beautifully with silver and gold garlands, and the table was perfectly set with my mother's expensive imported crystal. I had spent the previous 3 hours alone in the kitchen, carefully basting the holiday roast and preparing all the side dishes while the rest of the family relaxed and sipped expensive champagne in the living room. Brianna was holding court as usual. Tonight she was wearing a brand new custom silk gown gifted by her husband Gavin. Gavin was a white investment banker who my parents treated like a literal deity. To them, having a wealthy Wall Street son-in-law was the ultimate status symbol, the final piece of the puzzle to secure their place in high society. They hung on to his every word and constantly compared my single status and my supposedly boring office job to his glamorous lifestyle. I was carrying the heavy silver gravy boat from the kitchen into the dining room. The hallway connecting the two rooms was narrow. Brianna was standing near the archway laughing loudly at one of Gavin's stories. Suddenly, she stepped backward right into my path. I immediately tried to pivot to avoid hitting her, but my heel caught the thick edge of the Persian rug. I stumbled slightly and my shoulder brushed against hers. Not a single drop of gravy spilled, and the contact was incredibly minor, but the slight brush caused Brianna to gasp dramatically. She spun around, her eyes wide with manufactured rage. She looked down at the hem of her expensive dress, which was completely untouched and perfectly clean. Then she glared at me. Without a second of hesitation, she raised her hand and struck me fiercely across the face. The sharp crack echoed loudly through the entire dining room. My cheek burned instantly. The room fell completely silent. "Are you blind or just stupid?" Brianna shrieked, her voice bouncing off the high ceilings. "You almost ruined my dress. Gavin paid $4,000 for this silk, and you clumsy idiot, you are just trying to ruin my pregnancy announcement because you are jealous." I stood there frozen, the heavy silver boat still perfectly balanced in my trembling hand, the sting of the slap radiating across my jawline. I looked over at Gavin, who was casually leaning against the mahogany doorframe. A smug and satisfied grin played on his lips as he slowly swirled the drink in his glass. Then I looked at my parents, hoping for just a fraction of support. Valerie rushed forward immediately. However, she did not come to check my burning face or ask if I was hurt. She rushed straight to Brianna to frantically inspect the fabric of her dress. "Oh, honey, are you okay?" she cooed gently before turning a vicious glare directly on me. "Morgan, what is wrong with you? You are 31 years old, unmarried, working some boring desk job, and you cannot even walk through a room without trying to sabotage your sister's special moment. You have always been so bitter about her happiness." I swallowed the painful lump in my throat and tried to defend myself. "Mom." I did not even step on her dress. She backed into me while I was carrying the hot food. Do not talk back to your mother, my father Harrison boomed loudly. He stepped into the light, aggressively adjusting his expensive silk tie. We are hosting very important guests tonight. Gavin is currently helping my logistics company go public, and I will absolutely not have you disrespecting his wife in my home. Say sorry to your sister right now or get out of my house. The heavy silence stretched on. Brianna stood tall with her arms crossed, eagerly waiting for my public submission. Say it right now, Valerie hissed sharply. Apologize to Brianna. I slowly walked over and placed the gravy boat down on the table. I looked Brianna dead in the eye, and then I looked directly at my parents. I am not apologizing. I said, my voice incredibly steady and completely devoid of emotion. My father did not say another word to me. He simply turned around, walked straight to the front entryway, and held the heavy oak door wide open. Then get out, Harrison said coldly. I immediately left. I drove away from the sprawling estate without looking back. The cold December air seeped through the windows, but it was nothing compared to the chill I felt inside. My cheek still throbbed fiercely where Brianna had struck me. The physical pain was sharp, but the emotional sting was something I had lived with for over a decade. I navigated the quiet, winding roads of our affluent Atlanta suburb. The mansions on either side were illuminated by extravagant holiday displays, projecting an image of warmth and perfection. It was the same hollow perfection my parents worshipped. As the miles stretched between me and the house, the memories began to surface, one after another. I remembered the humid summer day I sat in the university financial aid office at 19. The counselor slid a piece of paper across the desk and told me my tuition check had bounced. I had panicked and called my father from a payphone. He did not sound apologetic when he told me the money was gone. He explained casually that Brianna needed a professional pageant coach and a custom wardrobe for her upcoming competition. He called it an investment in her future and told me I was resourceful enough to figure out my own way. I ended up working 3 jobs and taking out crushing student loans just to stay in school while Brianna paraded across a stage wearing my college fund. The flashbacks did not stop there. I drove onto the empty highway and thought about the day I moved into my first apartment. I was sleeping on a cheap air mattress surrounded by unpacked boxes. My mother Valerie had called me crying hysterically. It was not because she missed me. Brianna had maxed out 2 credit cards on a luxury vacation in Tulum and was facing serious legal trouble overseas. Valerie demanded I wire my entire savings to bail her out. When I hesitated, reminding her that I needed to pay my rent, she accused me of being selfish and trying to destroy my sister's life. I transferred the money that afternoon. I ate plain rice for a month just to keep the lights on. Every milestone I achieved was hijacked by Brianna's manufactured crises. My parents constantly drained my resources, my energy, and my spirit to fund her lavish lifestyle. They saw me as an endless well they could draw from whenever the golden child needed water. They always assumed I was just a low-level clerk, pushing papers at a boring firm. They never bothered to ask about my actual title or what I did every day. If they had paid any attention at all, they would have known I was not a weak paper pusher. I was a senior director of operations at one of the most ruthless debt acquisition firms in the country. My entire career was built on forensic accounting, identifying distressed corporate assets, and aggressively acquiring defaulted commercial loans. I spent my days dismantling fraudulent businesses and executing hostile takeovers. I was the person the major banks called when they needed to recover millions of dollars from people exactly like my father and his golden son-in-law. I guided my sedan off the highway and pulled into a deserted shopping plaza. The parking lot was empty except for a few flickering street lamps casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. I parked in the darkest corner and left the engine running. The heater was finally blowing warm air, but my hands were still freezing. I reached over to the passenger seat and unzipped my heavy leather work bag. I pulled out my secure corporate laptop and rested it heavily against the steering wheel. I flipped the screen open and the bright glow illuminated the dark interior of my car. I connected to the encrypted mobile hotspot and logged into the firm portal. The high-level security clearance recognized my credentials immediately. I bypassed the standard employee dashboards and went straight to the restricted administrative files. I opened the master folder labeled Harrison Logistics. For the past 6 months, I had been quietly monitoring my parents' business accounts from the shadows. I knew exactly how deep in debt they really were. I knew about the secret commercial loans my father took out to maintain their wealthy image at the country club. I knew about the home equity line of credit they had completely exhausted to pay for Brianna's extravagant wedding. More importantly, I knew they had missed their last 3 consecutive payments on the primary business loan. The bank had quietly sold their defaulted debt to my firm just 2 weeks ago. I stared at the screen, analyzing the exact numbers one last time. They owed millions. The clauses in the acquisition contract gave my firm the immediate right to recover the funds through total asset seizure since the account was severely delinquent. I navigated to the execution command window. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I thought about the sting of the slap ringing through the dining room. I thought about my mother telling me to get out. I thought about my father holding the heavy oak door wide open. There was absolutely no hesitation left in me. I typed in my final authorization code. A prompt appeared on the screen asking for the execution timeline. I selected the immediate action protocol and scheduled it for the nightly system refresh cycle. I typed in the final command asset seizure and account freeze execute at 2 in the morning. I pressed the enter key firmly. The screen flashed green, confirming the irrevocable order was locked into the banking system. I closed the laptop, plunging the car back into total darkness. It was done. Tomorrow they would wake up to a reality they could not buy their way out of. I put the car back in drive and pulled out of the empty parking lot, heading toward my own home, leaving them to their fate. Back at the sprawling brick colonial, the holiday party had finally ended. The caterers had packed up their silver trays and left. The heavy oak front door was securely locked. The house was completely silent except for the low hum of the central heating system. It was 2 in the morning. In the master suite, my mother Valerie was propped up against a mountain of plush silk pillows. She was wide awake. The glow of her tablet illuminated her face as she scrolled through an exclusive designer boutique online. She was already planning Brianna's extravagant baby shower. She had loaded her digital shopping cart with imported Italian lace linens, custom crystal centerpieces, and a vintage silver rattle that cost more than my first car. The total was staggering, but to Valerie the price tag was simply a necessity to maintain her image among the Atlanta elite. She navigated to the checkout page and confidently entered the details of her heavy metal black card. She pressed confirm and waited for the familiar screen thanking her for her purchase. Instead, a red error message flashed across the screen. Transaction declined. Please contact your financial institution. Valerie frowned slightly. She assumed it was a standard security hold due to the late hour and the large transaction amount. She tapped the screen and tried processing the payment a second time. The same red text appeared instantly. Annoyed, she reached into her designer nightstand and pulled out her Platinum Rewards card. She typed in the numbers and hit submit. Declined. She tried a third card. Declined. Her irritation quickly morphed into a hot prickle of anxiety. Valerie snatched her phone from the bedside table and dialed the 24-hour luxury concierge service attached to her primary account. She tapped her manicured nails against the headboard while waiting for a representative. When a polite voice finally answered, Valerie immediately adopted her haughtiest tone, demanding to know why her cards were blocked. The representative placed her on a brief hold. When he returned, his tone had shifted from accommodating to strictly professional. He informed her that a sweeping corporate lien had been executed against all linked accounts. Every single line of credit, every checking account, and every savings portfolio under her name and social security number had been completely frozen. Valerie demanded to speak to a manager, screaming that they were making a massive mistake. The representative calmly stated that the freeze was not initiated by the bank, but by an external debt acquisition firm executing a defaulted commercial loan seizure. The call disconnected, leaving Valerie staring blindly at her blank phone screen. Down the hall in his mahogany-paneled home office, my father Harrison was also awake. He was sitting in his leather chair nursing a glass of scotch and admiring the framed country club certificates on his wall. His phone suddenly buzzed violently on the heavy wooden desk. It was an automated emergency alert from the commercial bank that handled all the finances for Harrison Logistics. Harrison picked up the phone expecting a routine notification about a cleared vendor payment. He opened the text message, and the blood instantly drained from his face. The message was a high-priority security alert, stating that the primary operating accounts for his trucking fleet had plummeted to zero. He slammed his glass down, spilling expensive scotch across his desk. He lunged for his laptop and frantically navigated to the banking portal. His hands were shaking so badly he mistyped his password twice. When he finally broke through the security firewall, the dashboard loaded, and his worst nightmare became a terrifying reality. The numbers on the screen were entirely red. The payroll account that held the wages for his 70 drivers was empty. The equipment leasing account used to maintain his massive fleet of freight trucks was completely drained. Even the secret emergency reserve fund he had hidden from Valerie was gone. Every single account displayed a balance of 0.00. A stark gray banner spanned across the top of the portal with bold black letters. Account restricted pending asset seizure protocol. Harrison felt a crushing weight press down on his chest. He could not breathe. The logistics company was his entire identity. It was the only reason the community respected him. If those accounts were empty, his trucks would not run tomorrow. His drivers would quit. The vendors would sue him. The empire he had built on a foundation of hidden debt and fake prestige was collapsing in real time. He pushed himself out of his chair, knocking it backward onto the Persian rug. He stumbled out of the office and sprinted down the long carpeted hallway. At the exact same moment, Valerie burst out of the master bedroom, clutching her tablet to her chest. Her face was pale and her eyes were wide with sheer terror. They nearly collided near the top of the grand staircase. Harrison grabbed her shoulders, his voice a panicked whisper asking if she had spent the company money. Valerie shook her head frantically, tears ruining her expensive night cream. She told him all her cards were dead and the bank mentioned a corporate lien. The reality of the situation crashed over them simultaneously. The secret was out. The massive commercial loans Harrison had taken out to fund their lavish lifestyle and pay for Brianna's wedding had finally caught up to them. They had spent months dodging the collection notices, hoping Gavin's investments would miraculously save them. Harrison grabbed his phone and desperately scrolled through his contacts. He found Gavin's number and pressed call. He needed his wealthy Wall Street son-in-law to fix this immediately. The phone rang 6 times before going straight to voicemail. Harrison tried again. Another voicemail. He called Brianna next, but her phone was turned off. The panic in the dimly lit hallway escalated into pure hysteria. Valerie collapsed against the wall, sobbing uncontrollably about how she would show her face at church on Sunday if her black card was revoked. She wailed about the country club dues and the car leases. Harrison paced back and forth, pulling at his hair, muttering that it had to be a computer glitch. They were the highly respected Harrison family. Things like this did not happen to them. They were completely oblivious to the fact that their downfall was not a random glitch or a bank error. They had absolutely no idea that the architect of their destruction was the very daughter they had thrown out into the cold just hours before. Every second that ticked by brought them closer to the morning light. The morning meant business hours. It meant the reality of their zero balances would become public knowledge within their professional circles. Harrison imagined the whispers at the country club. He imagined the harsh glare of the bank managers who had previously shaken his hand with respect. He looked at Valerie, who was still clutching her useless credit cards as if they were a lifeline. She was already mourning the loss of her social status before she even understood the full scope of the devastation. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, and the walls were rapidly closing in. They sat together on the floor of their silent mansion, surrounded by expensive things they no longer owned, agonizing over their sudden ruin, and waiting for a miracle from Gavin that would never come. At 6 in the morning, the sun began to rise over the city skyline, casting a warm golden light across my downtown loft. I was standing in my modern kitchen, making a simple pour over coffee. My apartment was quiet and peaceful, and entirely paid for by my own hard work. It was a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I knew was unfolding across town at my parents' sprawling brick colonial. I wore a simple silk robe and watched the city wake up below me, through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I felt no guilt about what I had done. I felt no remorse. For the first time in my 31 years, I felt a profound sense of clarity and absolute control. My phone began to vibrate violently against the cold granite countertop, disrupting the morning silence. The caller ID flashed my mother's name, Valerie. I let it ring 5 times, watching the screen light up the dim kitchen. I slowly picked it up and pressed answer. I did not say hello. I just brought the phone to my ear and listened. "Morgan, you need to get down to your office right now," Valerie shrieked through the speaker. Her voice was shrill, hysterical, and completely unhinged. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not mention the stinging slap I had received from Brianna the night before. She did not apologize for throwing me out into the freezing cold. "There was a computer glitch at the bank overnight and all our accounts are locked," she demanded frantically. "Your father's logistics company accounts are sitting at zero. My black card was declined when I tried to order the imported lace for your sister's baby shower. You work at one of those boring financial processing places, right? Call whoever is in charge of customer service and tell them to fix this immediately. Tell them we are the Harrison family and this error is completely unacceptable. We have country club dues processing today and the leases for the luxury vehicles are due. Fix it now, Morgan." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The rich, dark roast tasted exceptionally good this morning. I let the silence stretch over the phone line for a long moment, letting her frantic, heavy breathing fill the empty space. I wanted her to sit in her anxiety. "It is not a computer glitch, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "What are you talking about?" Valerie snapped, her impatience flaring up instantly. "Of course it is a glitch. Do not argue with me, Morgan, just do what I tell you for once in your miserable life. Use your little clerk position to look up the routing numbers and fix the system. Gavin is not answering his phone and your father is having a severe panic attack in the hallway. We need this resolved before the bank opens and people start asking questions." I turned my back to the windows and leaned against the counter. "You really have absolutely no idea what I do for a living, do you?" I asked quietly. "After all these years, you still think I just file papers in a gray cubicle somewhere. You never once asked about my promotions or my degree. I do not have time for your bitter attitude today," Valerie yelled. "Fix the accounts, Morgan, before your father loses his mind." I took a deep breath and finally unleashed the heavy truth I had been holding back for years. I am not a low-level clerk, Mom. I am a senior director of operations at Apex Debt Acquisition. I am a federally certified forensic accountant. I specialize in identifying, investigating, and aggressively acquiring severely defaulted commercial loans from major banks. And exactly 2 weeks ago, my firm purchased the primary commercial debt portfolio for Harrison Logistics. The line went completely dead silent. For several long seconds, the only sound was the faint hum of my refrigerator. When Valerie finally spoke again, her tone was entirely different. It was uncertain, wavering dangerously between confusion and outright denial. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What are you saying to me right now?" "It means that you and Dad have been lying to everyone in your social circle," I explained smoothly, laying out the facts like clinical evidence. "You have not been wealthy for a very long time. You secretly maxed out the home equity line of credit on the family estate to pay for Brianna's extravagant wedding. You took out predatory commercial loans under the logistics company name just to keep paying your expensive country club memberships. And you stopped paying the commercial bank 3 months ago. Your accounts were classified as severely delinquent toxic debt. So the bank sold your defaulted loans to my firm for pennies on the dollar." "You are lying!" Valerie gasped violently. Her breathing was becoming rapid and shallow. You are just making this up to scare us because you are insanely jealous of your sister and her perfect husband. You do not have that kind of power over us. We are a prominent family. I have all the power, Mom. I corrected her sharply, my voice cutting through her delusions. I was the one who personally audited your financial files. I was the one who saw the fake expense reports Dad submitted to hide the missing money. And last night, while you were happily shopping online for baby gifts, I was the one sitting in my cold car pressing the button to execute the corporate lien. I froze the accounts, Mom. It was not a glitch. It was me. I legally own your debt. Morgan, please. Valerie stammered, the arrogant, commanding edge completely stripped from her voice, replaced by pure, desperate panic. You cannot do this to us. We are your family. Your father is going to lose his entire business. The freight trucks cannot run today without payroll and fuel money. We have absolutely nothing left. You have to log back in and reverse it. I am your mother. I cannot reverse a legally binding federal asset seizure, I replied coldly. And even if I had the authorization to do it, I would not. You made your choices for decades. You chose to drain my college tuition fund to buy Brianna pageant dresses. You chose to force me to empty my savings to bail her out of foreign jails. You chose to throw me out of your house on Christmas Eve for a crime I did not commit, just to protect the fragile ego of your precious white son-in-law. Gavin is going to fix this, Valerie cried out desperately, clinging to her last pathetic shred of hope. He is a brilliant Wall Street investment banker. He will simply transfer the funds from his massive portfolio and pay off whatever we owe your firm. He is going to save us, and you are going to look like a vindictive fool, Morgan. I almost laughed at her incredible blind delusion. You should definitely try calling Gavin again, I suggested lightly, allowing a hint of dark amusement to creep into my tone. But you might have a very hard time getting through to him this morning. He is going to be a little tied up with some unexpected visitors. What do you mean, unexpected visitors? Valerie demanded, her panic spiking to a new extreme. Morgan, what did you do? I did not answer her frantic questions. I took one final sip of my coffee, enjoying the quiet peace of my home. Have a nice morning, Mom, I said, and firmly ended the call. I placed the phone face down on the cold granite counter and waited for the real show to begin. Across town in the grand hallway of the family estate, Valerie stared in sheer disbelief at the blank screen of her phone. She stood frozen, holding the device tightly against her chest, as if trying to squeeze an explanation out of it. Harrison paced relentlessly back and forth, his expensive silk slippers patting softly against the hardwood floor. He repeatedly asked Valerie what Morgan had said, and if the banking glitch was finally fixed. Valerie slowly lowered the phone, her face completely drained of all color. Her voice trembled uncontrollably as she told Harrison that Morgan claimed to own their debt and that the commercial bank had sold the logistics company loans to Morgan's firm. Harrison stopped pacing abruptly. He vehemently refused to believe it, calling it a ridiculous lie, born out of deep-seated jealousy. He insisted that Gavin would fix the entire mess the moment Wall Street opened for business. Valerie desperately needed to hear Gavin's voice to reassure her that their wealthy son-in-law was still their ultimate savior. Her fingers shook violently as she navigated her contacts and pressed the button to call Brianna, hoping she would answer and pass the phone to her husband. The line rang twice before Brianna answered. Her voice was thick with sleep and severe annoyance, demanding to know why her mother was calling at such an ungodly hour. Valerie practically sobbed into the receiver, begging Brianna to wake Gavin up immediately. She babbled incoherently about frozen accounts and Morgan's terrifying threats. Before Brianna could even process the frantic words tumbling out of her mother's mouth, a piercing sound cut through the phone line. Valerie stopped talking and strained her ears. It was the loud, unmistakable wail of heavy sirens. The high-pitched noise grew rapidly louder and more intense until it sounded like it was right inside Brianna's luxury townhome. Harrison leaned closer to Valerie, pressing his ear against the back of the phone. Through the speaker, they could hear the frantic barking of neighborhood dogs and the screeching of heavy tires stopping abruptly on the pavement outside. Brianna sounded confused and terrified as she told her mother there were flashing red and blue lights, illuminating her bedroom windows. Valerie heard the sound of heavy footsteps running across Brianna's perfectly manicured front lawn. Then came a booming voice, amplified by a megaphone, commanding everyone inside the residence to remain completely still. A fraction of a second later, a deafening crash echoed violently through the phone speaker. The heavy reinforced front door of Brianna's multi-million-dollar home was violently kicked open off its hinges. The brutal sound of splintering wood and shattering glass made Valerie scream and drop the phone onto the carpet. Harrison quickly scrambled to his knees and put the device on speakerphone, his heart pounding fiercely in his chest. Through the clear audio, they heard the chaotic stampede of heavy tactical boots swarming into the foyer. Deep, authoritative voices echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings of Brianna's house, identifying themselves as federal agents. Brianna shrieked in absolute terror, screaming at them to get out and threatening to call the local police. One of the agents loudly announced that they were the Federal Bureau of Investigation executing a federal search and seizure warrant. Valerie and Harrison listened in frozen horror as the chaos unfolded live in Brianna's master bedroom. They heard the terrifying sounds of a physical struggle, followed by a loud, heavy thud as someone was forced violently onto the floor. Gavin yelled out in pain and indignation, demanding to call his lawyers and shouting that he personally knew the mayor. The federal agent did not care about Gavin's elite connections. His voice cut through the room with absolute authority, reading the official charges aloud. He stated that Gavin was being placed under immediate arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and the operation of a massive financial Ponzi scheme. The words hit Valerie and Harrison like physical blows to the stomach, knocking the wind completely out of them. The agent continued outlining the staggering scope of the investigation, stating that the so-called elite Wall Street investment fund was nothing more than a highly sophisticated scam. He announced that Gavin had defrauded dozens of high-net-worth individuals out of millions of dollars using new investor funds to pay fake returns to older clients, while skimming the rest to fund his lavish lifestyle. Valerie covered her mouth to stifle a gut-wrenching sob as the brutal truth finally set in. The custom silk dresses, the luxury vehicles, and the extravagant overseas vacations were all paid for with stolen money. Through the speakerphone, they heard the distinct metallic click of heavy handcuffs locking securely around Gavin's wrists. Brianna was crying hysterically, begging Gavin to tell them it was a horrible mistake. Gavin did not offer any comfort or reassurance to his pregnant wife. Instead, he angrily cursed at the federal agents and demanded his right to remain silent. The grand illusion of the perfect wealthy white son-in-law shattered instantly, leaving behind the pathetic reality of a common corporate criminal. Harrison sat motionless on the hallway floor, staring blankly at the expensive wallpaper. The devastating realization of what this meant for his own business slowly began to suffocate him. He had trusted Gavin completely. He had handed over millions of dollars from his logistics company to Gavin's fake investment fund, believing the promised massive returns would cover his own secret commercial debts. He had illegally mortgaged his family legacy to impress a man who was nothing more than a charismatic thief. Now the money was gone forever. Gavin's fund was an active federal crime scene. And Morgan, the daughter he had thrown out of his house like garbage, was the only person holding the legal rights to his entire ruined empire. The federal agents continued their aggressive raid, tearing through Brianna's pristine home, confiscating computers, hard drives, and boxes of hidden financial documents. Valerie reached down with trembling hands and finally ended the call, cutting off the sounds of her golden child sobbing helplessly in the background. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The morning sun was fully up now, streaming brightly through the large decorative windows of their colonial mansion. But there was absolutely no warmth in the light. The perfectly manicured life they had sacrificed everything to build had been completely obliterated in less than 5 hours. They had absolutely nothing left but their overwhelming, crushing debt and the bitter taste of their own monumental hubris. I stood in my kitchen listening to the distant sounds of the city waking up below me. It had only been a few minutes since I hung up on my mother, but the peace of my morning was already broken again. I placed my empty coffee mug in the sink and turned to walk toward the bathroom to get ready for my workday. Before I could even leave the kitchen, my phone lit up and began to vibrate violently against the cold granite counter. The caller ID flashed a picture of Brianna. It was a professional headshot she had taken for her luxury cosmetics brand. Her perfect blonde hair and bright smile looked completely absurd considering the brutal reality of her current situation. I picked up the phone and pressed the green button to answer. The sound of sheer hysteria poured out of the speaker the moment the call connected. Brianna was hyperventilating and sobbing so violently she could barely form a complete sentence. Her voice was completely unrecognizable, distorted by pure panic and uncontrollable rage. When she finally managed to catch her breath, she unleashed a torrent of vicious accusations directly at me. She screamed that I was a sick, jealous monster who could not stand to see her happy. She accused me of forging financial documents and calling federal agents to ruin her life. She yelled that I had always hated Gavin because he was successful and I was not. She demanded that I call the authorities right now and confess that I made the whole thing up just to destroy her pregnancy announcement. I stood perfectly still and let her scream. I did not interrupt her frantic meltdown. Through the speaker, I could hear the terrifying sounds of federal agents actively tearing her house apart in the background. I heard heavy doors slamming open and muffled authoritative voices giving strict orders to catalog evidence. I heard the sharp sound of glass breaking as someone carelessly dropped something in their aggressive search. Brianna kept crying and telling me that Gavin was a good man and a brilliant investor who simply made a few minor administrative errors. She said I had destroyed her family legacy just to satisfy my own bitter resentment, and that she would never forgive me for sending the feds to her door. When she finally ran out of breath and the line grew somewhat quiet, except for her heavy, wet sobbing, I decided to speak. My voice was completely calm and entirely unbothered by her emotional collapse. I told her she was giving me way too much credit for her current nightmare. I explained clearly that I did not call the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I told her I had absolutely nothing to do with the criminal raid currently happening in her expensive living room. My jurisdiction at the firm was strictly limited to acquiring and collecting the defaulted commercial debt our parents had foolishly accumulated. I told her I only audited the numbers for the bank. Brianna stammered loudly, her voice laced with deep confusion and stubborn denial. She asked me what I meant and who else could have possibly known about Gavin's private business affairs. She insisted that Gavin kept a very tight circle and that no one else had any access to his highly secure financial records. She tried to convince herself that I was lying just to cover my own tracks. I took a slow, deliberate breath and decided it was finally time to shatter the last remaining piece of her perfect illusion. I told her that Gavin did not keep a very tight circle after all. I explained that while I was conducting the forensic accounting audit on our parents' logistics company, I noticed a series of bizarre recurring wire transfers. Massive sums of money were being funneled directly from Gavin's supposed investment fund into a private shell company registered under a fake name. From there, the stolen money was being used to pay the expensive monthly lease on a luxury high-rise penthouse in Midtown Atlanta. I made sure to emphasize that it was not a corporate office space, but a highly exclusive residential apartment. I heard Brianna stop breathing on the other end of the line. The crying completely ceased. I continued speaking, laying out the brutal facts without a single shred of sympathy. I told her that the penthouse was occupied by a 22-year-old girl named Chloe. She was a former bottle service waitress Gavin had met at an exclusive nightclub 2 years ago. I explained that Gavin had been fully supporting her for 24 months, paying her rent, buying her expensive designer bags, and taking her on secret tropical vacations, while Brianna was busy planning her fake high society charity events. Brianna let out a choked, pathetic gasp and denied it instantly. She whispered weakly that Gavin loved her and would never cheat on her. She tried to say he worked late hours to provide for their future baby and their perfect life together. I did not let her sink into the comfort of her delusion. I told her the truth was much worse than just simple infidelity. I explained that when Gavin's fraudulent schemes started to inevitably collapse, he panicked. He needed every single dollar he could find to pay off the angry early investors who were aggressively demanding their money back. So 3 months ago, he abruptly stopped paying Chloe's rent. He cut off all her luxury credit cards and entirely stopped answering her phone calls. He thought she was just a dumb, naive girl he could easily discard without any consequences. But Chloe was not stupid at all. Over the course of their 2-year affair, she had quietly listened to him brag about his illegal financial operations. She had secretly taken pictures of confidential financial documents he carelessly left sitting on her kitchen counter after a few drinks. She had saved every single text message and every single email where he foolishly incriminated himself. When the formal eviction notice arrived at her penthouse, Chloe was absolutely furious. She packed up all the damning evidence, put it in a neat little folder, and marched straight into the federal building downtown. She handed over everything to the authorities and cut a full immunity deal for herself to avoid any accessory charges. "The person who tipped off the feds was not me," I said quietly, letting the heavy words sink in. "The person who destroyed your perfect husband and your perfect life was the 22-year-old mistress he decided he no longer wanted to pay for. She was the actual whistleblower. I just followed the money trail after the federal investigation was already well underway." The silence from Brianna's end of the line was absolute and terrifying. The shrill, hysterical anger had completely evaporated and was replaced by a profound and devastating shock. The entire foundation of her identity was built on being the chosen golden child, the perfect daughter with the perfect wealthy husband. Now she was being forced to realize that her entire marriage was a complete sham funded entirely by stolen money and shared with a girl fresh out of college. I did not wait for her to formulate a response. I told her she should probably start looking for a very good divorce lawyer, assuming she could find one willing to work for free, since all her bank accounts were about to be seized by the government. I reminded her that the custom silk dress she loved so much, the one she slapped me over, was paid for with the tears of ruined investors and the dirty money of a cheating liar. I ended the call right there and turned my phone completely off. I walked into my bathroom and turned on the hot shower, ready to start my successful day, knowing the toxic empire they built had finally burned straight to the ground. The harsh reality of their situation arrived at precisely 10 in the morning. A black town car pulled into the sweeping circular driveway of the family estate. A man in a dark suit stepped out, holding a thick manila envelope. Harrison watched him from the large bay window of his home office. He assumed it was a legal courier sent by Gavin to explain the massive misunderstanding with the federal agents. He practically ran to the heavy oak front door to receive the package. He did not even wait for the man to knock. He snatched the envelope and tore it open right in the foyer. Valerie hurried down the grand staircase, her silk robe trailing behind her. She asked if Gavin had sent instructions on how to access the hidden offshore accounts. Harrison did not answer her. His eyes scanned the crisp legal document, and the remaining color drained from his face. It was not a letter from Gavin's lawyers. It was a formal notice of foreclosure and immediate eviction. The document stated that due to severe and prolonged default on multiple commercial loans, cross-collateralized with the residential property ownership of the estate, had officially reverted to Apex debt acquisition. They were given exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises before local law enforcement would arrive to physically remove them and their belongings. Valerie snatched the paper from his trembling hands. She read the words, but her mind simply refused to process the devastating reality. She threw the document onto the expensive console table and scoffed loudly. She told Harrison that it was just a pathetic scare tactic engineered by Morgan. She insisted that Morgan was throwing a childish tantrum and using her little office job to print fake legal documents just to punish them for the Christmas dinner argument. Valerie vehemently refused to believe that the daughter she had belittled her entire life possessed the actual power to take away her home. Harrison nodded in desperate agreement. His fragile ego could not handle the alternative. He convinced himself that the federal raid on Gavin's house was just a routine compliance check blown wildly out of proportion by aggressive government agents. He told Valerie that Gavin was a brilliant investment banker who was simply caught in a temporary liquidity trap. They both agreed that their primary focus had to be securing Gavin's immediate release. They firmly believed that once Gavin was out on bail, he would easily make a few phone calls, access his massive Wall Street funds, and pay off the annoying debt Morgan was trying to collect. They formulated a plan built entirely on their own staggering delusions. They would use their prestigious standing in the Atlanta high society to secure a temporary bridge loan. They just needed enough cash to post Gavin's bail and hire a top-tier defense attorney. Harrison went upstairs and put on his finest tailored suit. Valerie spent an hour applying her heavy makeup and perfectly fixing her hair, trying to erase the physical signs of her sleepless night. They were determined to project an image of absolute confidence and unshakable wealth to the outside world. Harrison drove his luxury sedan to the exclusive country club, where he had been a highly respected member for over a decade. He walked into the lavish men's lounge expecting to be greeted with the usual warm handshakes and respectful nods. Instead, the room went completely quiet the moment he stepped through the heavy oak doors. Men in expensive golf attire suddenly found their drinks very interesting and actively avoided making eye contact with him. Harrison approached a small group of wealthy business owners he considered his closest friends. He forced a hearty laugh and casually mentioned that his son-in-law was dealing with a minor administrative issue with the feds. He smoothly asked for a short-term personal loan of $500,000, promising a massive return on investment once Gavin's fund was unfrozen. The men stared at him with a mixture of profound pity and deep disgust. One of them, a prominent real estate developer, finally broke the uncomfortable silence. He told Harrison that the news of the early morning raid was already all over the local financial networks. He bluntly stated that Gavin was running a massive Ponzi scheme and that millions of dollars from their own community were permanently gone. The developer told Harrison that nobody in that room would ever give him a single dime. He suggested Harrison leave the club immediately before the board of directors officially revoked his membership. Harrison stood there completely humiliated. The prestigious respect he had purchased with borrowed money vanished right in front of his eyes. He turned and walked out of the club, his face burning with deep shame. While Harrison was being rejected at the country club, Valerie was experiencing her own spectacular downfall at their mega church. She walked into the massive glass and steel building, demanding an immediate private meeting with the head pastor. She sat in his lavish office and dramatically wiped away fake tears. She played the role of the devoted mother facing a spiritual test. She asked the church to dip into the emergency benevolence fund to help bail out Gavin, claiming the devil was trying to destroy her righteous and generous family. The pastor looked at Valerie with cold, tired eyes. He gently closed his thick leather Bible on his desk. He informed her that several high-profile members of the congregation had invested their retirement savings into Gavin's fund, based entirely on the Harrison family endorsement. Those elderly members had just learned their entire life savings were wiped out because of her son-in-law. The pastor told Valerie that she was no longer welcome to serve on the charity committee or the church board. He politely but firmly asked her to leave the property and suggested she focus on her own deep need for repentance. Valerie stumbled out of the church completely shattered. The two pillars of her social identity, the country club and the church, had completely collapsed in a matter of hours. When she and Harrison finally reunited back at their seized estate, the massive house felt incredibly cold and terrifyingly empty. The eviction notice still sat on the console table glaring at them. They had no money, no friends, and no powerful white son-in-law to save them. Yet incredibly, they still refused to accept their own profound guilt. They still blamed Morgan for everything. Sitting in the dark hallway, they decided that phone calls were no longer enough. They needed to confront Morgan directly. They fully believed that if they marched into her office and used their parental authority, they could somehow force their disobedient scapegoat daughter to drop the ridiculous charade and restore their perfect lives. It was exactly noon when the front desk security team called my private office line. The head of security informed me that 3 individuals claiming to be my family were causing a massive scene in the main lobby. He said they were demanding immediate access to the executive floor and threatening to have the security staff fired if they were not allowed upstairs. I did not panic. I simply instructed security to print them temporary visitor badges and escort them directly to the glass conference room adjacent to my office. I wanted them to see exactly where I worked. I wanted them to feel the sheer magnitude of the world I had built without a single dime of their money. I stood up from my heavy mahogany desk and walked over to the soundproof glass wall of my office. From my vantage point, I had a perfect view of the main executive floor. Apex Debt Acquisition occupied the top 3 floors of the tallest skyscraper in downtown Atlanta. The space was a fortress of polished marble, sleek steel, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Dozens of highly paid financial analysts and ruthless corporate lawyers moved with quiet urgency through the open workspace. This was not a place for weak people. This was a place where financial empires were quietly dismantled and liquidated. A few minutes later, the heavy glass doors of the elevator bank slid open. Harrison, Valerie, and Brianna stepped onto the executive floor, escorted by 2 armed security guards. The sight of them was almost comical. They were trying desperately to project their usual image of untouchable high society wealth. Harrison was wearing his best tailored suit. Valerie was clutching a ridiculously expensive designer handbag. Brianna had hidden her swollen eyes behind massive dark sunglasses. But their fragile facade was completely crumbling. Their clothes looked slightly wrinkled. Their posture was rigid with suppressed panic. They looked exactly like what they were, which was desperate debtors facing absolute ruin. They stopped in the middle of the busy floor, completely disoriented by their surroundings. They had always pictured me working in some dingy cubicle farm filing paperwork for a middle manager. Instead, they found themselves standing in the nerve center of a multi-billion-dollar financial institution. Valerie looked around with wide eyes, taking in the original modern art on the walls and the expensive custom furniture. I could see the profound confusion washing over her face. This environment completely shattered the pathetic narrative she had carefully constructed about my life. Brianna nervously adjusted her designer maternity coat, realizing that her entire luxury brand could probably be bought and sold by the administrative assistants working on this floor. Before they could spot me behind the tinted glass of my office, my executive assistant Marcus approached them. Marcus was a sharply dressed former corporate litigator who did not tolerate any nonsense. He politely asked them to wait in the conference room. Harrison immediately puffed up his chest and tried to use his booming, authoritative voice. He loudly announced that he was Harrison, the owner of Harrison Logistics, and he demanded to see his daughter right this second. He spoke to Marcus as if he were a lowly servant meant to be ordered around. Marcus did not even blink. He simply checked his digital tablet and calmly stated that Harrison Logistics was currently in active receivership and under federal review. He then coldly informed my father that loud voices were strictly prohibited on the executive floor. The surrounding analysts and lawyers briefly looked up from their screens, casting annoyed and pitying glances at my family. In their country club, Harrison was a king, but on my floor he was just another defaulted account number causing a minor disturbance. The sheer embarrassment instantly deflated him. He closed his mouth and silently followed Marcus into the glass conference room. I took my time before going in to meet them. I picked up a thick financial dossier containing every single detail of their ruined lives. I smoothed out my tailored designer suit. I had paid $5,000 for it and it commanded absolute authority. I walked out of my private office and made my way across the open floor. As I walked, several senior partners stopped to greet me with genuine respect. The head of the legal department asked for my approval on a massive corporate merger. The chief financial officer nodded to me, calling me director. I handled their questions effortlessly, displaying my undeniable power right in front of the glass conference room where my family sat waiting. Through the glass, I watched Valerie and Brianna observing me. Their mouths were slightly open in sheer disbelief. They watched powerful older men in expensive suits defer to me for final decisions. They watched me command the entire room without raising my voice. For 31 years, they had treated me like I was completely invisible. They had convinced themselves that I was nothing more than an ungrateful disappointment who envied their perfect lives. Now they were trapped in a glass box, being forced to witness the terrifying reality that I was vastly more successful and powerful than Gavin and Harrison combined. I finally turned the handle and pushed open the heavy glass door of the conference room. The atmosphere inside was thick with tension and the smell of my mother's heavy, expensive perfume. They all stood up simultaneously, as if driven by some lingering instinct to assert dominance. Brianna ripped off her sunglasses, her eyes red and furious. Harrison opened his mouth to start shouting his demands. Valerie stepped forward, raising her hand to point an accusing finger directly at my face. I did not let any of them speak. I walked to the head of the long, polished table and dropped the heavy financial dossier onto the surface with a loud, resounding thud. I did not offer them a seat. I did not offer them coffee. I looked at the three of them with the exact same clinical detachment I used when assessing a bankrupt corporation. "You have exactly 5 minutes to state your business," I said, my voice ice cold and echoing slightly in the large room. "And before anyone decides to raise their voice, remember that you are standing in my building. You are sitting in my conference room, and I am the person holding the legal title to every single thing you own. Start talking." Harrison slowly lowered himself into one of the expensive leather chairs at the table. He looked small for the first time in his entire life. The booming confidence he had used to intimidate me since I was a child was completely gone. He cleared his throat loudly, trying to muster whatever shreds of dignity he still possessed. He leaned forward and placed his hands flat on the polished table. He told me that this had gone far enough, and that I had successfully made my point. He said he understood that I was angry about the dinner last night, but that business and family should never be mixed. He demanded that I immediately sign the paperwork to forgive the corporate debt and release the lien on the family estate. He said I owed it to the Harrison legacy. He insisted that the logistics company was the foundation of our entire family, and that letting it collapse would destroy generations of hard work. He told me it was my fundamental duty as his daughter to protect our prestigious name in the community. I sat perfectly still and let his ridiculous demands wash over me. I did not blink. I did not interrupt him. I just stared at him with complete professional detachment. The sheer audacity of his request was almost fascinating. He really believed that the concept of family legacy meant something to me after he had spent 31 years actively excluding me from it. When I did not immediately respond to his demands, Valerie decided it was her turn to try a different tactic. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a delicate lace handkerchief. She pressed it against the corners of her eyes, squeezing out a few strategic tears. She let out a dramatic, trembling sigh and began her classic routine of emotional manipulation. She told me she was deeply hurt by my cold behavior. She said she could not understand how I could be so cruel and vindictive to the people who gave me life. She started recounting all the supposed sacrifices she made to raise me. She painted a completely fictitious picture of a devoted mother who gave up everything for her ungrateful child. Valerie looked right into my eyes and tried to gaslight me in front of my own staff. She said I was always a difficult and distant child, but that she had loved me anyway. She claimed she spent countless sleepless nights worrying about my future because I was so antisocial and stubborn. She completely erased the reality of my childhood, where I was forced to cook my own meals, do my own laundry, and pay for my own school supplies, while she took Brianna on luxury shopping sprees. She spoke softly and sweetly, trying to weaponize the concept of motherhood against me. She begged me to remember the times she held me when I was sick, completely ignoring the fact that the person who usually took care of me was our underpaid housekeeper. Then she shifted her focus to the real reason they were sitting in my office. She reached across the wide table and pointed a trembling finger at Brianna. Brianna was sitting rigidly in her chair, staring blankly at the wall, unable to even look me in the eye. Valerie begged me not to ruin Brianna's life. She said Brianna was going through a horrific trauma right now, and that the federal raid on her home was a tragic misunderstanding. She pleaded with me to release the funds so they could hire a premium defense attorney for Gavin. She told me Brianna was pregnant and that the stress of losing her home and her husband could harm the baby. She said I could not possibly be heartless enough to punish an innocent unborn child just because I was holding on to some petty childhood grudge. Valerie kept talking, her voice growing more frantic and high-pitched as she realized her emotional performance was not working. She said I had my successful career and my beautiful office, and that I did not need the money. She told me to be the bigger person and save the family. She said if I just signed the papers right now, they would welcome me back into the fold, and we could be a real family again. She offered me the conditional love I had spent my entire life craving, like it was a cheap bargaining chip. I listened to every single manipulative word they said. I watched my father try to command me, and my mother try to guilt me. I looked at my sister, who still felt entirely entitled to the money I had earned. They had marched into my corporate sanctuary completely ruined and facing federal indictments, and yet they still believed they were superior to me. They still believed they could easily bend me to their will. They thought the same toxic tactics they used in the dining room would work in the boardroom. When Valerie finally finished her tearful monologue, the large conference room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The faint sounds of the busy executive floor outside the glass walls only highlighted the intense quiet inside the room. They all watched me eagerly, waiting for me to break down, apologize, and hand them back their stolen empire. They expected me to cave under the heavy weight of family obligation. I slowly leaned back in my executive chair. I rested my hands on the thick financial dossier sitting on the table. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel any residual desire for their approval. The scared little girl who used to seek their validation was completely dead. The woman sitting in front of them was a senior director who ruthlessly acquired toxic assets for a living. And they were the most toxic assets I had ever encountered. I looked at Valerie and told her that her performance was incredibly moving but entirely useless. I told her I was not going to release a single dime of the frozen funds. I told Harrison that the Harrison legacy was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie funded by predatory loans and criminal fraud. Then I calmly reached into my suit pocket and pulled out my secure corporate smartphone. I placed it face up on the polished wood table right next to the thick file. I told them they were both incredible liars, but that their biggest lie was not about me. It was about Gavin. I told them they needed to stop pretending they cared about Brianna's marriage or her unborn child. I unlocked the screen and told them it was time to listen to a phone call they had desperately hoped would stay buried forever. I tapped the sleek screen of my smartphone and maximized the audio file on the display. I looked across the polished wood table at the three of them. I explained that when Apex Debt Acquisition takes over a defaulted commercial portfolio, we gain immediate and unrestricted access to all the corresponding legal discovery associated with the guarantors. I told them that the federal investigators had already extensively cataloged the mountains of evidence provided by Gavin's young mistress. Because our financial interests and the seized assets were now deeply intertwined, my corporate legal team had been granted full access to the transcripts and the recovered audio files. I looked directly at Brianna, whose face was pale and already slick with fresh tears from her mother's earlier performance. I told her to listen very closely to the exact people who claimed they wanted to protect her and her unborn child. I pressed play and pushed the phone to the center of the large table. The audio quality was incredibly clear and completely undeniable. It was a secretly recorded phone call from exactly 6 months ago. The first voice that filled the silent conference room was Gavin's. He sounded frantic, terrified, and completely pathetic. It was a stark contrast to the arrogant Wall Street banker who had casually smirked while I was slapped on Christmas Eve. On the recording, he was hyperventilating and begging my parents for help. Then my father's deep booming voice came through the speaker. Harrison was not yelling at Gavin for betraying his youngest daughter. He did not sound angry on her behalf. Instead, he sounded deeply annoyed and strictly calculating. Gavin confessed on the recording that Chloe, his 22-year-old mistress, was actively threatening to go public with their affair. He admitted that the girl wanted a massive financial payout to stay quiet and disappear. Sitting in the conference room, Brianna let out a quiet, suffocating gasp and covered her mouth with both hands. Her eyes darted wildly between the phone and our parents. But the worst part of the audio was not Gavin's pathetic confession. It was my mother's immediate response. Valerie's voice echoed from the phone, smooth, cold, and ruthlessly practical. She told Gavin to calm down and stop crying like a frightened child. She explicitly told him that Brianna could never find out about the girl. Valerie said on the recording that a messy public divorce would absolutely destroy the Harrison family reputation in their exclusive African-American elite circle. She actually called Brianna naive and said it would be easier to just manage the situation quietly rather than deal with her daughter's emotional breakdown. The recording continued to play ruthlessly, tearing down every single lie my parents had ever built. Gavin then admitted the darkest truth of all. He told my parents that he did not have the cash to pay the mistress because his elite investment fund was completely insolvent. He confessed openly to my parents that he had been running a Ponzi scheme falsifying the return statements for over a year. He told them that the federal authorities would inevitably notice the missing millions if he liquidated any more client assets. I watched my father's face turn a sickly shade of gray as his own recorded voice responded to the shocking confession of a massive federal crime. On the tape, Harrison did not threaten to call the police. He did not demand that Gavin pack his bags and leave his pregnant daughter immediately. Instead, Harrison offered a criminal solution. He told Gavin that he would secretly take out a massive predatory commercial loan against the family logistics company. Harrison promised to funnel the borrowed millions directly into Gavin's failing fund under the guise of a legitimate corporate investment. Valerie eagerly agreed on the recording, stating that the money would be enough to pay off the mistress and temporarily satisfy the angry initial investors until Gavin could secure new wealthy clients from their country club. They literally conspired to mortgage our family legacy and commit federal financial fraud just to keep up false appearances. They were willing to risk everything, just to ensure they still had a wealthy white son-in-law to parade around at their church events. I reached forward and pressed pause on the glowing screen. The sudden silence in the conference room was heavier and more suffocating than I had ever experienced. Brianna was staring at our parents with wide, unblinking eyes. The grand illusion of being the golden child was completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. She realized in that exact agonizing moment that she was never truly loved or protected by them. She was just a beautiful, convenient prop they used to secure their high society status. When Gavin became a massive liability, they did not protect her at all. They protected the public image of her perfect marriage. They knowingly left her in a fake relationship with a desperate criminal who was funding a mistress with stolen money. Brianna slowly stood up from her expensive leather chair, her entire body trembling violently. She looked at Valerie, who was staring down at her own lap, entirely unable to make eye contact with the daughter she had just claimed to fiercely protect. Brianna asked them how they could possibly do this to her. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried immense pain. She asked how they could smile in her face every single day, plan her baby shower, and talk about family values, knowing her entire life was a disgusting lie built on stolen money and infidelity. Harrison opened his mouth and weakly raised his hand to formulate a pathetic excuse, but he had absolutely nothing to say. The undeniable proof of his betrayal was still echoing off the glass walls. I picked up my phone and slipped it smoothly back into my tailored suit pocket. I looked at the three broken people sitting in my boardroom and told them that their desperate pleas for family loyalty were completely worthless. I told Harrison that he had deliberately ruined his own logistics company with his massive ego. I looked at Valerie and told her she had willingly sold her own daughter's happiness and safety just to maintain a fake smile and a front row seat at church. I placed both hands firmly on the table and leaned forward. I coldly instructed them to gather their things and get out of my building immediately before I called my security team to physically drag them out into the street. But before any of them could even move toward the exit, the heavy glass door of the conference room was suddenly shoved open. The heavy glass door of the conference room was suddenly shoved open, hitting the metal doorstop with a loud crash. My security team was standing right behind the intruders, looking ready to physically tackle them to the ground, but I raised my hand, signaling the guards to stand down. Walking into my boardroom with an arrogant swagger that completely defied his current legal situation was Gavin. He was no longer wearing the pristine tailored tuxedo from the Christmas dinner. He was wearing the wrinkled dress shirt and slacks he had been arrested in just hours earlier. The faint red indentations from the federal handcuffs were still clearly visible on his wrists. But despite looking slightly disheveled, he did not look like a man who had just been busted for a massive financial crime. He looked incredibly smug. Right behind him was a man wearing an aggressively expensive pinstripe suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. The man had slicked back hair and the cold, calculating eyes of a high-priced defense attorney who specialized in keeping wealthy criminals out of federal prison. Gavin walked right past my parents and Brianna. He did not look at his pregnant wife. He did not offer a single word of comfort to the woman whose house had just been raided by the feds because of his lies. He walked straight up to the opposite end of the long polished table and stared directly at me. For a brief, pathetic moment, my parents actually thought he was there to save them. Harrison stood up from his leather chair, his eyes widening with desperate hope. He called out Gavin's name, asking if the horrible recording was just a misunderstanding and begging him to fix the mess with my firm. Gavin did not even turn his head to look at my father. He simply told the old man to shut his mouth and sit down because the adults were doing business. The absolute sheer disrespect in his voice hit Harrison like a physical blow. The wealthy white son-in-law he had worshipped and sacrificed his own daughter for was treating him like a nuisance on the street. Harrison slowly sank back into his chair, completely broken. Gavin rested his hands on the polished wood and let out a loud, grating laugh. The sound echoed off the glass walls of my office. He looked at me and slowly clapped his hands together 3 times in a mocking gesture. He told me I had put on a fantastic show. He said he was genuinely impressed that the quiet little sister who always faded into the background had managed to climb the corporate ladder at a ruthless place like Apex Debt Acquisition. He admitted that buying the defaulted commercial loans of my parents' logistics company was a very clever move. But then his smile twisted into a vicious sneer. He told me I was completely out of my league and that I should have stayed in my lane. The slimy lawyer stepped forward and unlatched his leather briefcase. He pulled out a single thick document printed on heavy legal paper and slid it across the long table. It stopped right in front of my hands. Gavin leaned forward and told me that his elite Wall Street connections were much stronger than a simple federal raid. He proudly announced that a silent partner had already posted his massive bail, and that he had absolutely no intention of ever sitting in a prison cell. He then pointed a finger at the document sitting in front of me and told me to read it carefully before I started celebrating my hostile takeover of the family estate. I looked down at the paper, but I did not touch it. Gavin could not contain his desperate need to gloat. He loudly explained the contents of the document to the entire room. He told me that he was not a stupid man and that he had seen the financial collapse of his Ponzi scheme coming for several weeks. He knew the early investors were preparing to contact the authorities, and he knew my parents were defaulting on their massive commercial loans. So 30 days ago, he took action to protect his most valuable asset. He smugly revealed that he had executed a quiet title transfer on the sprawling colonial mansion. He had moved the legal deed of my parents' historic estate out of their names and directly into an anonymous offshore trust based in the Cayman Islands. My parents gasped in absolute horror. Valerie started crying uncontrollably, realizing that the home she prized above everything else was completely gone. Gavin laughed at their pain. He looked at me with cold, triumphant eyes and explained the legal reality of my situation. He said that because the house was now securely shielded by international corporate privacy laws, my debt acquisition firm could not touch it. He told me that international trusts are virtually impenetrable to domestic collection agencies, and that I had just wasted millions of dollars buying a completely worthless portfolio of unsecured debt. He boasted that he had completely outsmarted me and successfully stolen the only asset of real value right out from under my nose. Brianna let out a pathetic whimpering sound and reached her hand out toward Gavin. She called his name and asked what was going to happen to her and their baby now that the house was gone. Gavin finally looked at her. His eyes were devoid of any love or warmth. He looked at her like she was a piece of trash stuck to the bottom of his shoe. He casually told her that he would be having his lawyer file for divorce first thing in the morning. He said she was only useful to him when her family had money and prestige to offer him. Now that they were completely bankrupt and publicly disgraced, she was nothing but a heavy burden. He told her to enjoy living in a cheap apartment with her pathetic parents. Brianna collapsed forward onto the table, sobbing so violently she could barely breathe. Gavin did not care. He turned his attention back to me, flashing a perfectly white, arrogant smile. He told me I was just a bitter, lonely woman who tried to play a high-stakes game against a master and lost everything. He told me to have fun trying to collect pennies from my ruined parents, because that was all I was ever going to get. He buttoned his wrinkled suit jacket, turned around and walked out of the glass conference room with his lawyer right beside him. They left the heavy door wide open behind them. The silence that rushed back into the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of my sister weeping and my mother hyperventilating. They all slowly turned their heads to look at me. They expected me to look defeated. They expected me to be furious that Gavin had slipped through my fingers and humiliated me in my own building. They thought I was completely cornered and that my entire master plan had just failed spectacularly. I sat perfectly still in my executive chair, looking down at the offshore deed transfer document sitting on the polished wood. I did not frown. I did not show a single trace of panic. I just slowly reached out and picked up the paper. 3 weeks later, the heavy oak doors of the federal bankruptcy court swung open. The air inside the building was completely sterile and suffocating. The courtroom itself was a massive chamber of dark mahogany and green leather designed specifically to intimidate anyone who stepped inside. The high ceilings echoed with the quiet murmurs of clerks and federal marshals. I walked down the center aisle wearing a sharp charcoal gray suit, carrying a single heavy black leather briefcase. I did not look at the gallery benches or the spectators. I walked with absolute purpose and took my seat at the long, polished table designated for the primary secured creditors. The empty chair next to me highlighted exactly how isolating this process was, but I did not care. I was completely in my element. A few minutes later, the heavy doors opened again, and Gavin walked in. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy blue suit that probably cost more than most working families make in an entire year. His aggressively expensive defense attorney was walking right beside him, carrying a thick stack of manila folders. Gavin did not look like a desperate man facing multiple federal indictments and a massive involuntary bankruptcy proceeding. He looked like a wealthy young CEO arriving at a routine corporate board meeting. He leaned over and whispered a joke to his lawyer, and they both chuckled softly, ignoring the gravity of the room. Gavin was absolutely certain that his anonymous offshore trust in the Cayman Islands was completely bulletproof. He firmly believed he had successfully hidden his most valuable assets and that this federal hearing was just a minor administrative annoyance he had to endure before he could walk away, scot-free. Right behind Gavin walked my parents. Harrison and Valerie hurried down the center aisle looking incredibly out of place in the stark legal environment. They bypassed the neutral seating areas and chose to sit directly behind the defense table on Gavin's side of the courtroom. Their presence right behind him was the ultimate display of their staggering delusion and deeply toxic pride. After everything they had heard on that audio recording in my office, after watching their precious white son-in-law treat them like absolute garbage, they still desperately chose to align themselves with him. Valerie was wearing a dark conservative dress, trying her hardest to project an image of quiet high society dignity. She looked completely exhausted, her face drawn and pale, but her eyes still held a frantic, desperate hope. Harrison sat rigidly next to her, aggressively straightening his tie and glaring across the wide aisle directly at me. They had somehow convinced themselves that Gavin's illegal offshore transfer had miraculously saved the family estate. They truly believed that Gavin was playing some brilliant multidimensional financial chess game and that he was about to publicly humiliate me in front of a federal judge. They wanted him to put me in my place so badly that they were entirely willing to ignore the glaring fact that he had destroyed their business, their reputation, and their daughter's marriage. Brianna was noticeably absent from the courtroom. I had heard through the legal grapevine that she had finally moved out of their tiny temporary apartment and was staying on the couch of a distant cousin. She could not face the extreme public humiliation of the federal proceedings, and she absolutely could not stomach sitting next to the parents who had willingly sold out her happiness to protect their own fake social standing. She was finally beginning to understand the brutal reality of the family dynamic she had previously benefited from. The heavy side door opened, and the bailiff loudly announced the arrival of the federal bankruptcy judge, commanding everyone in the room to stand up. The judge was an older woman with sharp, piercing eyes and a well-known reputation for being completely ruthless against white-collar financial criminals. She sat down at the elevated wooden bench, adjusted her reading glasses, and immediately called the court to order. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted from quiet anticipation to intense legal scrutiny. Gavin's slimy defense lawyer stood up first, confidently buttoning his expensive suit jacket. He launched into a smooth, heavily rehearsed speech about how his client was simply an unfortunate victim of volatile market conditions and aggressive federal overreach. The lawyer argued passionately that all of Gavin's remaining domestic assets had been properly documented, surrendered, and liquidated. He claimed that there was absolutely no money left to distribute to the angry creditors. He conveniently glossed over the sudden transfer of the massive historical estate, acting as if the missing millions simply did not exist. He painted Gavin as a hard-working investment banker who just made a few administrative errors during a difficult economic downturn. While his lawyer spoke, Gavin sat back in his heavy wooden chair and casually crossed his legs. He actually turned his head slightly to look at me over his shoulder. He flashed that exact same arrogant, perfectly white smile he had given me on Christmas Eve right after Brianna had slapped my face. He truly thought the hearing was practically over. He thought the strict federal judge was simply going to accept his empty financial declarations, discharge his massive debts, and dismiss the primary creditor claims, leaving me with absolutely nothing. Harrison leaned forward on the hard wooden gallery bench, watching me intently, eagerly waiting to see my reaction to my impending and total defeat. But I did not frown. I did not look angry or defeated. I sat perfectly still and waited patiently for Gavin's lawyer to finish his ridiculous opening statement and sit back down at the defense table. The judge looked over the initial bankruptcy filings, pushing the thick stack of papers aside with a sigh. She then turned her sharp attention directly to my table. She asked in a loud, clear voice if the primary secured creditor had any objections to the financial disclosures presented by the debtor today. I slowly stood up from my chair and unlatched the heavy brass locks on my black leather briefcase. The loud click echoed through the silent courtroom. I looked directly at the judge and told her that I absolutely had objections. I announced that I was not just standing there as a frustrated creditor, but as a sworn federal forensic accounting expert acting on behalf of the United States government. I pulled out a massive stack of heavily redacted bank records and told the court that I had a very different and highly documented story to tell about exactly where Gavin's money had really gone. The federal judge adjusted her glasses and leaned forward, peering down at me from the elevated wooden bench. She asked me to state my full name and professional title for the official court record. I stood tall and spoke clearly into the microphone. I stated my name and identified myself as the Senior Director of Operations at Apex Debt Acquisition and a federally certified forensic accountant acting as a special financial expert for the prosecution. The moment those words echoed through the silent courtroom, Gavin's slimy defense attorney jumped up from his expensive leather chair. He loudly objected, claiming a massive conflict of interest. He told the judge that I was the debtor's sister-in-law and that my testimony was nothing more than a bitter personal family vendetta. The judge did not even look at him. She calmly reviewed the federal appointment documents sitting in front of her and overruled the objection immediately. She stated that my credentials were fundamentally impeccable and that my firm held the primary legal claim over the seized commercial assets. She ordered me to take the witness stand and proceed with my financial breakdown. I picked up my heavy black briefcase and walked slowly across the completely silent courtroom. I could feel the burning, terrified stares of my parents boring into the back of my neck, but I did not acknowledge them at all. I walked right past the defense table where Gavin was sitting. The arrogant, confident smirk had completely vanished from his face. He was finally realizing that I was not there to argue about petty family dynamics or ruined Christmas dinners. I was there to clinically and legally dissect his entire life under federal oath. I took my seat in the wooden witness box, raised my right hand, and swore to tell the whole truth. I opened my briefcase and pulled out 3 thick, heavy binders filled with highlighted bank records, wire transfer logs, and encrypted offshore communications. I arranged them neatly on the wooden ledge right in front of me. The federal prosecutor approached the stand and asked me to clearly explain the true structural integrity of Gavin's supposed Wall Street investment fund. I looked directly at the judge and began my expert testimony. I did not use complicated financial jargon to confuse the room or obscure the truth. I stripped away all the sophisticated lies and broke his business down to the absolute bare bones. I testified that Gavin's investment fund was never a legitimate trading vehicle. It was a classic textbook Ponzi scheme operating entirely on pure deception and predatory recruitment. I provided the exact numbers to the court. I stated that over the past 3 years, Gavin had aggressively collected nearly $40 million from private local investors, primarily targeting the wealthy elderly individuals at my father's country club and megachurch. I opened the first heavy binder and read the hard data out loud. I explained that less than 5% of that $40 million was ever actually invested in the stock market or any legitimate real estate ventures. The rest of the capital was systematically siphoned off to pay completely fake high-yield returns to the earliest investors, creating a fabricated illusion of massive financial success. I mapped out exactly how Gavin skimmed the remaining funds to finance his own extravagant personal lifestyle. I listed the millions spent on custom-tailored clothing, luxury imported vehicles, exotic overseas vacations, and the multi-million-dollar townhome he lived in with my sister. The courtroom was dead silent as the staggering scale of his absolute theft was laid bare for everyone to hear. Gavin sat completely frozen at the defense table. His face was pale, and his jaw was clenched so tight, the muscles in his cheek twitched visibly. His expensive defense attorney looked frantically through his own legal files, desperately trying to find a technical loophole in my testimony, but there was absolutely nothing he could do. Financial data does not lie, and my forensic paper trail was completely airtight. I moved on to the second binder and ruthlessly exposed his massive network of fraudulent shell companies. I explained how Gavin created dozens of fake corporate entities with names that sounded like legitimate, sophisticated wealth management firms. He used these dummy corporations to aggressively launder the stolen money, moving it rapidly across state lines and through anonymous accounts to completely avoid domestic detection. I did not hold anything back from the public record. I turned to a specific highlighted page and detailed the recurring wire transfers to a private limited liability company registered in Delaware. I explained to the judge that this specific shell company had only one actual function, which was paying the exorbitant monthly rent, luxury credit card bills, and designer shopping habits of Gavin's 22-year-old mistress. I read the exact dollar amounts out loud, reducing his secret glamorous affair to nothing more than a cold, calculated line item in a massive federal fraud investigation. Sitting directly behind the defense table, Valerie let out a sharp, horrified gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hand. Harrison stared blankly ahead, his entire worldview crumbling as the brilliant white son-in-law he idolized was officially documented as a common thief who funded his cheating with their friend's retirement money. The prosecutor asked me to address the defense lawyer's opening statement regarding the excuse of market volatility. I looked right at Gavin's lawyer and shook my head. I testified that market volatility had absolutely nothing to do with the total collapse of the fund. The fund collapsed because Gavin simply ran out of new victims to defraud. I presented the internal encrypted emails I had successfully recovered from his professionally wiped hard drives. The emails explicitly showed Gavin panicking as his cash reserves completely dried up. He knew the entire scheme was imploding, and he desperately needed a massive, rapid infusion of cash to stop the angry early investors from calling the federal authorities. This was the exact moment I tied my parents directly into his dark web of criminal destruction. I opened the third binder and presented the commercial loan documents officially signed by my father. I testified that when Gavin was on the verge of total federal exposure, he actively manipulated his own father-in-law into taking out a massive predatory commercial loan against a perfectly legitimate family logistics company. I showed the court the direct, unedited wire transfer of $3 million moving straight from my father's corporate business account into Gavin's fraudulent holding company. I proved definitively that Harrison had completely bankrupted his own generational legacy just to keep Gavin's massive criminal lie afloat for a few more pathetic months. By the time I finished explaining the precise financial flow of the stolen $3 million, Gavin was physically shrinking in his heavy wooden chair. The untouchable elite Wall Street persona was completely stripped away, leaving behind a terrified, desperate criminal who was about to lose his entire life. The federal judge stared down at him with absolute, unmistakable disgust. The forensic evidence I presented was overwhelming, completely irrefutable, and structurally perfect. I had successfully dismantled his entire financial empire piece by piece, leaving him with absolutely no viable legal defense. But I was not finished yet. I slowly closed the third binder and looked directly at Gavin, knowing perfectly well that the most devastating piece of evidence was still sitting safely at the bottom of my black leather briefcase. I reached down into the bottom of my heavy black briefcase. The courtroom was still vibrating from the revelation of the stolen $3 million, but I knew the true killing blow had not yet been delivered. I pulled out a single bright red folder. Unlike the thick, heavy binders that contained the corporate financial data, this folder contained only a few specific pieces of highly sensitive paper. The federal judge watched me closely, her expression completely unreadable, as I placed the red folder gently on the wooden ledge in front of me. Gavin's defense lawyer stood up again, his voice noticeably lacking the aggressive, arrogant confidence he had displayed just an hour earlier. He preemptively argued to the court that any offshore trusts established by his client were legally protected private entities that fell completely outside the jurisdiction of this domestic bankruptcy proceeding. He nervously reminded the judge that the title transfer of the Harrison family estate to the Cayman Islands Trust was fully executed a full 30 days before any federal indictments were ever filed, making it a legally binding restructuring of private family assets. I opened the red folder and pulled out the high-resolution copies of the offshore deed transfer. I looked right at the slimy defense lawyer and calmly agreed with his assessment. I stated out loud for the court record that under normal financial circumstances, an offshore trust established prior to a federal indictment would indeed be incredibly difficult for any domestic collection agency to pierce. Hearing this, Gavin let out a loud, shaky breath of pure relief, his rigid shoulders dropping slightly in his tailored suit. He leaned back in his chair and actually smiled. He truly thought he had won that specific battle and successfully hidden his ultimate prize. But then I turned my attention back to the federal judge, and the smile on his face completely vanished. I told the judge that the Cayman Islands Trust was indeed designed like a financial fortress, but the core foundation it was built upon was entirely fraudulent. I presented the original deed transfer document to the court clerk, alongside a sworn forensic handwriting analysis officially conducted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I pointed directly to the primary signature line at the very bottom of the page. I testified clearly into the microphone that the signature supposedly belonging to Harrison was a complete forgery. I explained that Gavin did not just manipulate his foolish father-in-law into signing the massive historical house away. Harrison never signed the legal transfer document at all. Gavin had electronically lifted Harrison's signature from a previous commercial loan application and digitally forged it onto the offshore property transfer. The entire courtroom erupted into loud, shocked gasps. Gavin's own lawyer actually took a physical step away from the defense table, staring at his client in complete horror. Forging a signature on a federal real estate transfer across international lines was not just a minor white-collar technicality. It was a massive standalone felony that instantly voided the entire transaction, making the Cayman Islands Trust completely null and void. The federal judge leaned over her elevated bench and asked the bailiff to hand her the handwriting analysis. She studied the document carefully for a long, agonizing minute, before looking down at Gavin with a gaze filled with absolute contempt. His defense attorney slowly sat down, dropping his head into his hands, realizing his client had lied to him and that the case was completely unwinnable. But I did not stop there. I looked directly across the wide aisle at my parents, who were sitting completely frozen behind the defense table. Harrison was gripping the hard wooden bench so tightly his knuckles were completely white. Valerie's mouth was hanging open in silent, suffocating horror. I turned back to the judge and stated that forging the property deed was only half of his offshore crime. I explained to the court that setting up a highly secure anonymous trust in the Cayman Islands requires a massive initial cash deposit to satisfy international banking regulations. Gavin was completely broke when he set up the trust because his Ponzi scheme was already actively collapsing, and his early investors were bleeding him dry. So he desperately needed to steal the massive setup funds from somewhere else. I pulled out the final document from the red folder. It was a series of highly classified banking logs from my parents' personal financial portfolio. I testified that Gavin had used the forged power of attorney to bypass the domestic banking security protocols. Over the course of 3 days, he systematically drained every single penny from Harrison and Valerie's joint retirement accounts. He took the money they had spent 40 years saving for their old age and wired it directly into his untraceable offshore account. But even that was not enough cash to satisfy his greed. I presented the final page showing that Gavin also illegally cashed out their massive whole life insurance policies. He took the heavy cash surrender value meant to cover their end-of-life expenses and funneled it straight to the Cayman Islands to secure his own wealthy future. The sheer magnitude of the theft hung heavily in the sterile courtroom air. Valerie let out a piercing, guttural scream that echoed violently off the high mahogany ceilings. She lost total control and lunged forward over the wooden barrier, grabbing the back of Gavin's expensive suit jacket. She was sobbing hysterically, screaming at him that he had stolen her entire life and her future. Harrison sat completely paralyzed, physically shaking and entirely unable to breathe. The absolute devastating reality of Gavin's betrayal had finally shattered their profound lifelong delusion. They had protected him from the truth. They had lied to their friends for him. They had thrown their own daughter out into the freezing cold just to protect his fragile ego. And in return, their perfect golden son-in-law had stolen their family business, their historic estate, their entire life, savings, and their life insurance. Federal marshals immediately rushed down the center aisle to pull Valerie off of Gavin. They dragged her back to the wooden bench while she continued to wail in absolute agony. Gavin sat frozen at the defense table, his tailored suit jacket violently wrinkled, and his hair completely messed up from Valerie's frantic grasp. His foolproof escape plan was officially dead. The offshore account he thought would fund his luxurious life after bankruptcy was now frozen government evidence. He had nothing left to hide behind. The brilliant Wall Street persona was gone, leaving only a terrified, desperate thief about to face decades in a federal penitentiary. I closed the red folder and sat back in the witness chair, feeling absolutely no pity for any of them. The federal judge did not waste a single second after my testimony concluded. She slammed her heavy wooden gavel down, demanding absolute order as the federal marshals finally forced my mother back onto the gallery bench. Valerie was a completely broken woman, gasping for air, her perfectly styled hair ruined, and her expensive makeup running down her face in dark streaks. Harrison was completely catatonic, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at the empty space in front of him. The judge turned her sharp, piercing gaze back to the defense table. Her voice cut through the lingering echoes of my mother's screams like a surgical scalpel. She formally declared that based on the overwhelming forensic evidence provided by the federal expert, the Cayman Islands Trust was entirely compromised by fraudulent activity. She immediately signed an emergency judicial order, freezing the offshore accounts and classifying every single penny inside them as the direct proceeds of severe federal crimes. She authorized the international seizure of the funds, guaranteeing that Gavin would never see a single cent of my parents' stolen life savings. Gavin panicked. The smug, arrogant Wall Street confidence was completely eradicated, replaced instantly by the frantic terror of a trapped animal. He grabbed the sleeve of his expensive defense attorney's pinstripe suit, pulling desperately at the fine fabric. He begged the lawyer to object to file an emergency motion to do absolutely anything to stop the judge from taking his hidden money. But the lawyer did not help him. The high-priced attorney ripped his arm away from Gavin's grasp with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. The lawyer stood up aggressively, pushing his heavy leather chair back so hard it scraped loudly against the courtroom floor. He addressed the court, his voice shaking with professional indignation. He stated for the official court record that his client had deliberately lied to him and had knowingly provided forged legal documents to his legal counsel. He announced that under the strict ethical guidelines of the American Bar Association, he could no longer represent a client who was actively using his services to perpetrate an ongoing federal fraud. The lawyer formally requested to withdraw as Gavin's legal counsel effective immediately. The judge did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. She granted the motion with a sharp nod. The lawyer quickly packed his briefcase, snapped it shut, and walked straight out of the federal courtroom without ever looking back at the man who had hired him. Gavin was completely alone. He stood up at the defense table, his hands shaking violently, looking around the massive mahogany courtroom for a lifeline that simply did not exist. The federal prosecutor immediately seized the golden opportunity. He stood up and formally requested that the court permanently revoke Gavin's bail. The prosecutor argued that the new staggering evidence of massive international wire fraud, forgery, and the deliberate financial exploitation of his elderly in-laws proved beyond any doubt that Gavin was an extreme flight risk and an active financial danger to the community. The judge looked down at Gavin, her eyes filled with cold, absolute justice. She delivered a scathing rebuke of his character right into the microphone. She called him a predatory parasite who used the trust and love of a family to fund his own pathetic vanity. She told him that arrogant white-collar criminals like him often thought they were the smartest people in the room until the overwhelming weight of their own hubris finally crushed them. She formally revoked his bail and stated that he would remain in federal custody until his criminal trial, where he was now facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. She nodded to the federal marshals standing near the walls. Two massive armed officers approached the defense table immediately. They grabbed Gavin's arms, twisting them firmly behind his back. The harsh metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly through the silent courtroom. It was the sound of his entire fake empire finally locking him inside a cage. As the marshals dragged Gavin aggressively down the center aisle, he passed right by my parents. He did not apologize. He did not look at them. He just stared at the floor, a pathetic, ruined man shuffling in expensive leather shoes. Harrison and Valerie watched him go, their eyes tracking the heavy steel chains around his wrists. The devastating reality of their situation finally crashed down on them with the absolute force of a falling building. They were absolutely destitute. They had sacrificed their entire moral compass to protect this criminal. They had actively conspired to commit corporate fraud. They had lied to their devoted church congregation. They had alienated their wealthy friends, and they had brutally discarded their own daughter just to maintain the illusion of their perfect high society family. Now the illusion was completely dead and buried. They had no historic estate to return to tonight. They had no commercial logistics company to generate income tomorrow. Their entire life savings and their massive retirement accounts were frozen as criminal evidence. They did not even have the cash surrender value of their life insurance to buy groceries or rent a cheap motel room. They were going to be physically evicted by law enforcement in a matter of hours, and they had absolutely nowhere to go. Harrison buried his face in his trembling hands and began to weep. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was the loud, ugly sobbing of a broken man who realized his massive blind ego had just destroyed his entire bloodline. I sat in the witness box and watched them break down completely. I felt no joy in my chest, but I also felt no sorrow. It was simply the inevitable mathematical result of decades of toxic behavior finally reaching its absolute 0 point. The federal judge turned to me formally, thanked me for my extensive forensic testimony, and officially excused me from the witness stand. I stood up smoothly and calmly gathered my files. I placed the red folder and the 3 heavy binders back into my black leather briefcase. I latched the brass locks securely, feeling the deeply satisfying weight of a closed case. I stepped down from the elevated wooden box and walked confidently down the center aisle of the courtroom. I had to walk directly past the gallery bench where my parents were sitting completely destroyed. Valerie looked up at me, her eyes red and heavily swollen, her face a mask of total absolute despair. She weakly reached her trembling hand out toward me, hoping for a final sliver of the daughterly obedience she had mercilessly exploited her entire life. She whispered my name, her voice cracking with the sheer crushing weight of her pathetic ruin. I did not stop walking. I did not look down at her outstretched hand. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead, holding my head high and pushed open the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, walking out into the bright, clean light of the federal hallway, leaving them entirely alone in the dark ruins of the life they had chosen to build. The 72-hour eviction notice expired the very next morning. When the local sheriff's department arrived at the sweeping circular driveway of the historic estate, they did not come quietly. 3 marked patrol cars parked directly on the pristine manicured lawn, flashing their harsh red and blue lights for the entire wealthy neighborhood to see. Valerie and Harrison were forced to walk out of the heavy oak front doors, with nothing but 2 small plastic trash bags containing a few basic changes of clothes. Harrison tried to argue with the deputies, aggressively waving his hands and demanding to speak to a supervisor, but the lead officer simply unclipped his handcuffs and threatened to arrest him for criminal trespassing on private property. The federal asset freeze meant they were not allowed to take any of the expensive artwork, the custom furniture, the imported crystal, or even Valerie's extensive collection of designer handbags. Everything inside the house was officially classified as secure collateral for my debt acquisition firm. Valerie tried to cover her face with a cheap silk scarf as she walked down the wide front steps, but it was a completely useless gesture. The neighbors who used to attend their extravagant holiday parties and drink their expensive champagne were now standing visibly on their large porches, openly staring and whispering to one another. The deep, public humiliation that Valerie had spent her entire adult life trying desperately to avoid was finally happening right on her own front lawn, in broad daylight. They had to walk nearly 2 miles to the nearest city bus stop, because all three of their luxury leased vehicles had already been aggressively towed away by the commercial bank. The expensive leather loafers Harrison wore were meant for stepping out of luxury sedans, not for walking miles on cracked public sidewalks. And by the time they reached the bus stop, his feet were bleeding. Their desperate, pathetic attempts to salvage any remaining shreds of their high society status failed spectacularly over the next few days. The morning after the court hearing, Harrison received a cold, incredibly brief email from the board of directors at the exclusive country club. The email formally stated that his elite membership was permanently revoked, effective immediately due to a severe violation of their moral turpitude clause. The other wealthy African American families at the club felt profoundly betrayed that Harrison had used their shared cultural spaces and established community trust to funnel their retirement money to a white criminal. His name was physically unbolted and removed from the heavy bronze founder's plaque in the main clubhouse. His customized mahogany golf locker was completely emptied into a cheap cardboard box and thrown directly into the alley dumpster. Valerie's experience was even more emotionally devastating. She tried to attend the Sunday morning service at their massive elite megachurch, hoping to aggressively play the role of the tragic victim one last time. She wanted to stand in front of the large congregation and cry about how the devil had unfairly attacked her righteous family. But the head pastor had already instructed the private security team to block her at the heavy glass front doors. She was publicly turned away in the crowded main lobby right in front of the wealthy women she used to viciously gossip with on the charity committee. The church community completely shunned them, treating them like absolute diseased pariahs who had brought massive financial ruin and intense public shame to their prestigious congregation. They would not even answer her frantic phone calls. With absolutely no money, no powerful friends, and completely frozen credit lines, they had no choice but to apply for emergency government housing assistance. The exact same federal government they had actively tried to defraud was now their only source of basic daily survival. They were eventually placed in a tiny one-bedroom subsidized apartment in a heavily neglected neighborhood on the far industrial outskirts of Atlanta. The absolute contrast between their sprawling historic colonial mansion and this cramped concrete box was staggering. The apartment smelled faintly of damp mold and stale cigarette smoke from previous tenants. The drywall was paper-thin, and the loud, terrifying sounds of police sirens and violently arguing neighbors echoed through the small space all night long, making it impossible to sleep. There was no imported Italian marble, no high vaulted ceilings, and no custom crystal chandeliers. The small kitchen had cheap peeling linoleum floors and a rusted refrigerator that constantly rattled loudly. Valerie, who used to spend her entire afternoons browsing exclusive luxury boutiques online, now had to figure out how to stretch a small booklet of government food stamps to cover their basic weekly groceries. She absolutely refused to leave the tiny apartment during the daylight hours, terrified that someone from her glamorous old life might drive by and see her carrying cheap plastic grocery bags on the side of the road. Trapped together inside that tiny, suffocating space, their marriage rapidly dissolved into a state of constant, bitter warfare. The polite, refined, high society manners they used to mask their toxic relationship were completely stripped away. Every single day became an exhausting, vicious cycle of screaming and aggressively placing the absolute blame on one another. Minor inconveniences like a late utility bill or a broken cheap appliance instantly escalated into explosive physical arguments. Harrison constantly yelled at Valerie, accusing her of being a vain, deeply materialistic woman who forced him to take out the illegal commercial loans just to fund her endless obsession with maintaining their fake wealthy image. He screamed at the top of his lungs that her pathetic, desperate need to show off a rich white son-in-law to her judgmental church friends had completely destroyed his generational logistics empire. Valerie fiercely fired back, throwing cheap ceramic plates against the thin walls, calling him a weak, pathetic coward who lacked the basic business intelligence to see that Gavin was running a massive Ponzi scheme right under his nose. She blamed him for stupidly forging the federal documents and losing the historic estate to my firm. They completely tore each other apart daily, dissecting 30 years of deep resentment, profound failure, and endless lies. They had built their entire marriage on a shallow foundation of stolen money, fake prestige, and the shared daily abuse of their scapegoat daughter. Now that the money and the prestige were completely gone, they finally realized they had absolutely nothing left but pure, toxic hatred for one another. While my parents were busy tearing each other apart in their tiny, subsidized apartment, my sister Brianna was facing her own spectacular public downfall. For her entire life, Brianna had been the untouchable golden child, perfectly shielded from any real-world consequences by our parents' blind devotion. But neither Valerie nor Harrison possessed the power or the money to protect her from the massive federal fallout of Gavin's criminal empire. The first major pillar of her fake life to completely crumble was the highly publicized pregnancy. During the initial stages of the divorce and bankruptcy proceedings, the court mandated a standard disclosure of all medical records to establish potential child support and custody arrangements. Brianna tried desperately to avoid the medical evaluations, claiming intense emotional distress, but the federal judge was absolutely merciless. When the truth finally came out, it was more pathetic than anyone could have imagined. There was no baby. No. Brianna had completely fabricated the entire pregnancy. She later tearfully admitted to a court-appointed mediator that she had faked the announcement because she could feel Gavin pulling away from her. She knew he was spending massive amounts of money and spending nights away from home, so she used the oldest manipulative trick in the book to try and trap his attention. She used that fake unborn child to steal the spotlight at the Christmas dinner to justify spending $4,000 on a silk maternity dress, and to successfully manipulate our parents into giving Gavin more money. When the local Atlanta gossip blogs got a hold of the fake pregnancy story, she became an absolute laughingstock overnight. But the public humiliation of her fake pregnancy was only the beginning of her absolute ruin. Brianna had spent the last 3 years aggressively promoting her own luxury cosmetics brand. She constantly bragged about being a self-made female entrepreneur, hosting lavish launch parties and securing prime retail space in high-end boutiques. What she never publicly admitted was that the brand was a complete financial black hole. It never turned a single dollar of actual profit. The entire vanity project was fully funded by Gavin's stolen Wall Street money. He was using her cosmetic company as a convenient shell corporation to actively launder the funds he stole from his early investors. The moment the Federal Bureau of Investigation realized the connection, they immediately froze every single business account associated with her name. Federal agents raided her glamorous downtown warehouse, confiscating all the inventory, the computers, and the expensive manufacturing equipment. The luxury brand she had built her entire social media identity around was officially liquidated to pay back a fraction of the millions Gavin had stolen. Without Gavin's black credit cards and without her fake business, Brianna was completely destitute. She reached out to the massive network of wealthy high society socialite friends she had spent years carefully cultivating. These were the same women who attended her lavish parties, drank her expensive champagne, and constantly validated her massive ego. But the moment her name became synonymous with a massive federal Ponzi scheme and a fake pregnancy scandal, those so-called friends vanished completely. They blocked her phone number, unfollowed her on every social media platform, and instructed their private security guards to turn her away from their gated communities. She was entirely abandoned by the shallow world she had sacrificed her own sister to be a part of. Forced to face the brutal reality of basic survival, Brianna had to get a job. Because she had spent her early 20s partying and coasting on our parents' money, she had absolutely no college degree and zero actual marketable skills. The only job she could successfully land was working as a basic retail associate at a brightly lit mid-tier cosmetics counter in a crowded suburban shopping mall. The deep, poetic justice of her situation was almost hard to believe. The girl who used to mock my perfectly respectable corporate career was now forced to wear a cheap polyester uniform and stand on her feet for 9 hours a day. She had to swallow her massive pride and aggressively push cheap lipsticks and discount foundation onto the exact same working-class women she used to look down on. Occasionally, one of her old, wealthy acquaintances would happen to walk through that specific department store. Instead of saying hello, Brianna would panic and completely hide behind the bright cardboard display racks, deeply terrified of being recognized in her cheap uniform. She was trapped in a miserable, exhausting minimum wage existence, completely stripped of her beauty brand, her wealthy husband, and her golden child status. Exactly 1 year after the brutal Christmas dinner, where I was thrown out of my family home, I walked out onto the massive wrap-around balcony of my brand-new luxury penthouse. The morning air was crisp and cool, but I was wearing a thick plush robe that kept me perfectly warm. I held a steaming mug of expensive dark roast coffee in both hands, taking a slow, deep breath as I looked out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a brilliant golden light across the towering glass skyscrapers. I had purchased this penthouse entirely on my own, using the massive corporate bonuses I earned from successfully liquidating the Harrison Logistics portfolio. It was the highest point in the city, a quiet, beautiful sanctuary, far above the noise and the toxic chaos of the people who used to hold me down. There were no fake smiles here. There were no whispered insults, no stolen college funds, and absolutely no golden children. There was only the peaceful, quiet reality of a life I had built entirely with my own two hands. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the rich, bitter taste ground me in the present moment. Suddenly, the peaceful silence was broken by the soft buzzing of my personal cell phone resting on the glass patio table next to me. I casually reached over and picked it up. The screen lit up displaying an unsaved restricted number, but I knew exactly who it was. I swiped the green button to accept the call and brought the phone to my ear without saying a single word. The sound of loud, frantic sobbing instantly poured through the small speaker. It was my mother. Valerie's voice was completely wrecked, rough and breathless from crying. She sounded older, more fragile, and entirely defeated. "Morgan, please," she begged, her voice cracking desperately. "Please do not hang up on me. Your father and I have absolutely nothing left. The government housing is horrible, and we cannot afford our basic medication this month. Dad is working as a night shift security guard and his feet are ruined. Brianna will not even speak to us anymore. She blames us for everything. Please, Morgan, you have so much money now. You took our house and our business. You owe us. You have to help your family. We are begging you to just send a few $1,000s so we can eat." I stood perfectly still on my beautiful balcony, looking down at the tiny cars moving on the highway thousands of feet below me. I listened to her pathetic, desperate pleas and searched my heart for even a single ounce of sympathy. I looked for the scared little girl who used to crave her mother's approval, who used to do extra chores just hoping Valerie would smile at her. But that little girl was gone. She had died the exact moment Harrison opened that heavy oak door on Christmas Eve, and Valerie told me to get out. I realized in that moment that true closure does not always come from a dramatic screaming match or a tearful forced apology. Sometimes true closure is just a profound empty silence. I did not sigh. I did not offer her a lecture about karma or poor financial choices. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear, looked at the glowing screen and firmly pressed the red button to end the call. Then I opened the settings menu and permanently blocked the number without a single second of hesitation. I placed the phone face down on the glass table, completely cutting off the last remaining thread connecting me to their toxic world. I turned my face back toward the rising sun and took another peaceful sip of my coffee. Walking away from a table where you are no longer respected is the absolute greatest victory you can ever achieve. For decades, my family convinced me that I was the problem. They made me believe that I was difficult, bitter, and unworthy of love, simply because I refused to blindly worship the golden child and accept their toxic behavior. They tried to keep me small so they could feel big. But the moment I stopped fighting for a seat at their broken table, I realized I possessed the power to build my own empire. My revenge was not just taking their assets. My true revenge was proving that their entire existence was a fragile lie, while my success was undeniably real. If you are watching this video, and you are currently trapped in a toxic family dynamic where you are constantly the scapegoat, I need you to hear this clearly. You do not owe your abusers your loyalty just because you share the same blood. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to protect your peace, your finances, and your mental health. Your worth is not determined by the people who are too blind to see your value. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join a community of people who are breaking generational curses and taking their power back. Let me know in the comments below if you have ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your own peace. Share your story, because someone out there might need the exact courage you found. Remember that the strongest thing you can ever do is finally choose yourself.